canid vocalization is an area, and I mean the nuances and the subtleties, and different families have slightly different tones. You know, it's pretty incredible.
This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. How can you tell the difference between a wolf and a coyote? What's a coy wolf? Do they live alone or in packs? And are those packs like wolves, or are they different? We asked for questions, and we got them. A few weeks back, I asked on social media what your questions would be for Leslie Sampson, founder and executive director at Coyote Watch Canada. You answered, and then you kept on answering. Between Defender Radio and Coyote Watch Canada's social media, we had 2 packed pages of questions to go over in this recent interview. And I gotta be honest, we didn't get to all the questions. This episode is already pretty long, but we may be able to use some of those questions to create blogs for our website, so stay tuned on that. And because this is such a long episode, you'll be able to find some time codes for specific topics in the show notes in the coming days. For now, let's dive right in with my good friend, Leslie Sampson of Coyote Watch Canada. To start, I want to talk about coyotes mating and coyotes being protective of their den sites, because right now, we're at the end of May. Coyote pups are coming out, and we're hearing a lot of these things. It's messaging that you and I and other people in this field are used to hearing year after year after year, and that is the coyotes are out. They're going to protect their young. Be on the lookout. So let's start with, what are coyotes actually doing this time of year?
So they are, first and foremost, everything in canid family is all about those wee pups, this year's pups. And sometimes that can mean one of the older siblings coming back from, being on their own to help mom and dad raise this year's litter. It doesn't mean they're going to stay around. They do come back, and each family is so different. And so without generalizing, it's just sometimes folks will say to us, we always saw the same pair, and then this third one, we keep seeing this third one hanging around. And with all likelihood, that's one of the yearlings from last year, right? And so everything is about, making sure that those pups are receiving not only the parental protection, but all of the nourishment and all of the teachings that go hand in hand for them to grow and mature and meet those seasonal milestones that will truly, prepare them to be at one day on their own as a coyote adult.
It's very much the same as how we raise our children, just condensed and with more fallen fruits, vegetables, and mice, pretty much.
Absolutely. And oftentimes we find when folks in a community understand what those seasonal developmental stages are for wild canids like fox, coyotes, and wolves, they have a better understanding, because if, for most of us, we have a family dog in our home. And when you look at dog development in coyote world, though, those animals, when you think about it, they are really prepared if they needed to disperse in the fall time. So that's a very short window of development. And so oftentimes when they're now at the end of May, they will be on their way, probably heading towards a rendezvous site or a safe zone. And that's an area that mom and dad choose for those pups to essentially hang out in while mom and dad forage and hunt. And they go back to that area and bringing those food resources and other could be playthings like feathers and bones and golf balls and fishing lures, depending on what's in the environment. And so that then is that family has transitioned from the home den now to a rendezvous site. And so that den won't be used again. And if it's available and clean, it won't be used again till next springtime by this family. And that is one of the probably the most confusing aspects of coyote milestones, is that people think that they're living in the dens all year round. And, one thing we do find now in urbanscapes, there is an assumption by many folks that are, in advocacy, first response, wildlife businesses that are tasked with wildlife proofing properties and humanely moving out wildlife. Oftentimes, a coyote family might only have one den in an urbanscape. So we try to work with folks. Right now for Coyote Watch Canada, we're getting a 10 to 1 fox calls. So we're seeing a different dynamic with fox in the community this year.
It's always interesting. Oh, so I just got a beard hair in my mouth.
Ew.
Yeah, I know. I'm keeping this in, by the way.
Ew.
Because this is the glamour of podcasting with a big beard.
Thank gosh to see what we really look like.
No, I'm drinking cup. My beard's been growing out because we're not allowed to do anything, and that is making my face sad. So it's crying hair. And I got and the problem, my mustache gets in my coffee. Then I sip my coffee. And I get hair. I know, it's terrible. At least I can tell it's mine. So,
yes.
Anyway,
well, Jay, you can't blame JJ because that hair would be really fine, and you'd probably swallow it.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, back to coyotes.
Right. For the listeners, JJ is Michael's beautiful 4-legged family member that he shares his homestead with. So,
and many pictures of her on my Instagram. But anyway. The other part of the seasonality I wanted to talk about is we're at the trail end of this now, but you and I ended up writing a relatively in-depth article with a bit of an investigative aspect to it. Because in recent years, we have both, and many other people have seen, variations on this meme. And it always tends to be in spring. Right. It can be early spring, it can be late spring, it can bleed in the summer, start up again in fall. But it shows a coyote biting the collar of a dog. And the dog looks terrified. It's a very harrowing image, and it's got information saying, like the one we have in this article I'm looking at, which I'll link in the show notes, is please be aware the next 4 to 6 weeks is mating season for coyotes. Do not let your dogs out alone. Coyotes, get your dog to chase him, and somewhere in the distance pack waits for your dog, which we know is false. Anyway, it's got other types of information. There's various forms of it. But you and I saw this and immediately both had the same thought that this isn't what's going on in this picture. And I think this is such an important lesson. Again, it is quite seasonal because this is the time of year this one comes around again. But do you want to talk a bit about what we did to sort of break down what was actually happening in this image and the story behind it?
Yeah. So, I mean, in any kind of outreach in community work, there's always going to be those individuals that, first of all, no matter what kind of scientific data and support and rigorous science is presented, it doesn't matter. But a photo speaks 1,000 words, and there's nothing better at getting people's fear and their emotions riled up than to see a photograph without any context. And so what had happened, we actually had one of our volunteers from the United States actually investigated that photo. And that's when you and I had that discussion, and we said, look, this has to be exposed because this is actually a coyote that is in a trap that has been essentially attacked by 3 trapline hound dogs. And, it's unfortunate that the majority of people that shared that photo with all the good intentions in the world, they actually didn't have the wherewithal to understand what was going on. When you actually analyze the photograph, you can immediately see that coyote is restrained just by the body, the positioning of the body. And so, the series of photos that followed that particular one with the coyote the teeth on the collar. The series of photos that followed showed the coyotes hind and around the neck. You could see saliva, you could see hair up. So those dogs were actually attacking the coyote while in the trap. And people were devastated. I mean, that meme was shared at one point. A veterinarian clinic from the U.S. shared that, and it was circulated on social media close to 1 million times. So that demonstrates for those folks that really get drawn into a photograph how false that is and how misleading and how really it's actually betrayal. I don't believe that the folks that originally had shared it on this veterinarian page understood what they were sharing, but that also then brings us to the point where we are now, is that if you're going to share something, you better make sure of the origin, what the context is, and also ask yourself, does this seem actually, what they're saying, does it really add up? And so the dialogue, the written communication that followed that photo was that mating season, the males are aggressive, they're going to lure your dog, and all sorts of really, for anybody that knows canine behavior and that has observed them for years and years, and then if you look at the science behind those statements, it comes up short. But people don't realize that. And so the myth of luring and, of course, the aggression, no. With wild canids, it's defensive, protective, territorial. It's a reaction. It's a manifestation of what that coyote is going through at that time. And what people don't realize is that in coyote world, dogs are another predator. It might as well be another coyote because they have their set territory, and any dog that's a threat that is appearing to want to harm one of the family members, especially during this time of year, mom and dad are going to do their best to protect their babies like you and I would, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the other things that's quite interesting about this is definitely the number of people who shared it thinking they were helping. I think that is so telling. And one of the reasons that you and I have these rambling, often unrecorded conversations about social media. Because when you then look at this stuff with that critical eye, whether it's a subject you're super familiar with, or, like for me, I just have the tools. So look at that and say, something's not right. Google reverse image, start finding the pieces and connecting them. And we ended up coming across, I believe it was an old Flickr account where this photo series lived. And you could see, and again, most people, I'd say the vast majority of people, simply had no idea that this photo was actually of a series that clearly documents a trapped coyote being harassed and attacked by at least 3 dogs. And again, it's unfortunate because the way it's presented makes you want to share it. But as we said, that's one of the great times to ask another organization. If you see something like this and you're not sure, shoot it over to us. We're happy to have a look at it and give you our thoughts. And this is a process I know with the Fur Bears. I'm not too sure what Coyote Watch Canada's process is. But before I share anything, I follow the thread of logic. I follow the links. I check the citations.
Absolutely.
When possible, I follow the money. Because there are people out there who are using this intentionally. Now, again, I'm going to underscore, because I 100% agree with what you said, the vast majority of people, including that one vet clinic, had no idea that there was any maliciousness behind this. They were trying to be helpful, and we thank them for that. It's just in this case, it's a very clear example of there's more going on than we can see. And with the instant gratification of social media, we don't do the work that maybe we used to do to determine whether or not it's real.
Well, I mean, we've all been targeted by individuals that are just motivated by hate and, trying to, I don't know, they're just unhappy with their lot in life, and they will stop at nothing, including, putting photographs out and claiming that it is you or someone else in your organization, knowing full well that it's not. And, we've had that happen. It happened last year. And, those instances need to be called out, definitely documented, because those individuals have a pattern of doing that. And so, to actually put a person's name on a photograph knowing full well it's not them, it becomes a legal issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it does.
And the thing is, with that photo series, as you mentioned, it's not that the individual who had that account was misrepresenting what was happening. People just took what they wanted from that.
Yes.
Without really providing all of the facts. But then if they had have provided all the facts, most people would have chosen not to share that particular photo of the coyote being, grabbing the collar, right?
Okay, well, on that note, let's dive into our questions. So a few weeks ago, we had put out to people, what are your questions about coyotes? And we got a ton of awesome responses on both Coyote Watch Canada and the Fur Bear social media, as well as a couple directly sent to me. So I'm just going to go through these. There's a couple that kind of are similar and I'll group together. And the one I wanted to start with is, what is the role of a coyote in their habitat? Because this is something that I think doesn't always get fully understood, because especially here in Ontario, coyotes are perceived as new, which they're not.
Right.
But there's this perception that they're new because we didn't see them very often for a long time. So let's talk about what the role of a coyote in their habitat is, whether that habitat is, a ravine in York region, a field in Niagara, outside Calgary, or in a park in Vancouver. Like, what do they do for their habitat and the ecosystem?
Well, I think, again, I'm glad that you brought up region, because their role might look a little different in a desert scape or along a shoreline, ravine systems. I mean, they're moving through their home range. There is that transient coyote that will have a different impact on an ecosystem, but they're moving around quite a bit. They don't have a territory of their own, so they really need to work a little bit harder at, redefining where their food sources are. But, as they're really what we call the true ecothermometer in locations and habitats, because if things are functioning really well and healthy, you'll have that resident family that is thriving there. If human food is being introduced, there's artificial food sources available, then that is going to also influence, family survival. And so if the landscape is really conducive to having, two pups surviving and remaining in that territory during the next year, but then somebody is leaving piles of dead stock or dead deers out from hunting, that could influence the survival. But their main source of diet is going to be what is local. So it could be anything from snails to nuts to insects, definitely carrion. They clean up animals that have died, and oftentimes you'll see a coyote running down the street. You can't really identify whether it actually killed the animal or not, because they will grab roadkill and take that back to their family or eat it for themselves. And so they really do help keep those species that are hosts for ticks down, the voles and the mice, any of those small mammals. They consume a lot. I mean, we were observing the head of the family, the female. This was a location we were researching in the beginning of 2000. This was under another project, not Coyote Watch Canada, but she, within an hour period, had captured 8 small voles. Wow. And I mean, that's incredible in 1 hour.
That's better than like a professional pest company could do.
Oh yeah, and I mean, they move animals through a system too, right? Mm-hmm. But if you've got somebody that sets up a trail cam and puts food out at that trail cam site, every animal species in that area, including cats and dogs, if they're free roaming, are going to check that spot out. And if that location consistently has a false food source there, that's going to change coyote behavior. And that's what we don't want. We don't want coyotes hanging around in a backyard. We don't want coyotes, going to a location because somebody thinks that they need to eat, or they feed, they're feeding coyotes because they think it'll keep them from, killing their cat, which should be in a catio or indoors anyway. And so they are very good. They're creative and natural foragers and hunters. And we just need to make sure that we don't interfere with their ability to navigate throughout their territory and decide whether it's viable or not for them to stay.
Well, and talking about what they eat, I think it's really interesting because you and I both saw reference to an urban study in progress that claimed something like 22% of an urban coyote's diet is made up of cat. And what got me right off the top was this person, this researcher, indicated in their language that coyotes kill and eat cats, and it makes up 20% of their diet. But that's a massive inference from the data. The data is that they consume matter from cats. Right. And when you start, and again, I can look out my window, my tiny little basement window, any given day of the week, living here in an urban center, and see a cat outside. And once a week, I see a dead cat outside. Yeah. We've got outdoor and feral cats here, and they are most often, I remember working for the newspaper one time, this is going back many years, I wrote about I think it was in the first quarter of the year, something like 200 cats were found on the side of the road by local animal control. Yes. And they said, we can't say that these were all killed by cars, and we can't say that ones that weren't right on the road and were 10 meters away weren't killed by cars, but it gives an indication of the volume of that issue. And that was in a suburb. So you can imagine in a city, there's likely even more. So when we hear this, we also then need to interpret the data for what it's actually saying. The data is saying that in this case, this specific data set is indicating that a coyote's diet, on average, based on several in one area, that's key. The location, the time of year, because if you did that same scat analysis a year or 2 years later, that would be the marker on whether that actually is a realistic assumption based on the data of scat analysis. So it's really, really important because most of the scat analysis is not identifying roadkill. Yes. They're going, or they say undefined domestic animal. Dr. Shelley Alexander's scat analysis out of Calgary was amazing because there was only, I believe, six scats, I think 6 or 8 scat analyses that demonstrated any kind of domestic animal, and they couldn't really identify. And so of that, though, how much was roadkill? And in an area, I think the one research paper you're referencing, I do believe, is the LA paper. Yeah. It was Los Angeles, just for everyone to have context. It's a big city. Well, and how many of them met their demise because of human interference, right? Oh, exactly. Exactly. We don't know. Yeah. And so, but for somebody, a layperson, to look at the research and not really understand how that's relevant and how do we look at it and use rigorous scrutiny and what does the data actually mean, it can be, overwhelming. Oh, yeah. And that's the thing is, I'm not even looking at the data itself. I'm looking at how the data was presented, because it's assuming intent. And this is something of side note that's actually really big with anxiety disorders, is assuming what other people are thinking. And maybe that's one of the reasons I think about that too much, is with my anxiety disorder and all of the therapy over the years. But Anyway, let's move away from nerdy science and talk more about fun things, such as, do coyotes really eat roadrunners, Leslie?
Well, I know there's something circulating on social media right now, and it's somewhat of a humor driver for some folks, and others it's, oh my gosh, to see any animal. But when it comes to coyotes that are carrying anything that it resembles a once living animal, people just find that hard to get their head around. But they're eating; they have to eat. So, you know what? I'm sure if there's a dead roadrunner there, maybe they're going to take that animal. I have no backgrounder on that photograph that's circulating on social media, so really I can't even talk to it. Mm-hmm. But obviously that coyote had a roadrunner in his or her mouth.
So we can say they can eat roadrunners. However, we are uncertain about the technology used to catch said roadrunners.
Well, and what's the context, right?
Yes.
I mean, and really, are we okay? But I guess my next question would be, and okay.
I think it was a bit of a fun one.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, based on good old Wiley, that cartoon still haunts us till this day, doesn't it?
Yep. And I will admit, I have called coyotes wily as a journalist. I will own that. It was before I met you. Leave me alone. Anyway. One of the ones, and this is a themed kind of question, I'm going to rephrase because it came in a couple of different ways. Talking about coyote units, coyote packs, coyote families, there was a couple of questions. Do coyotes live in packs like wolves? Are they solitary or do they live in small packs? One person said they've heard stories of more than one coyote, but they only ever see one at a time. And there was a couple of different kind of questions around that. So what is that family dynamic? What's the pack? How do we talk about that specific to coyotes?
So, depending on where the research is coming from and the language being used, that now really it's more common to refer to coyote family dynamics as a really essentially bonded unit. So to refer to them, unfortunately, the word pack, many folks will hear that and think that this is a group of unrelated coyotes that have packed up. And that's just not canid behavior. So it's going to be one family. And I mean, Dr. Stan Gert did just absolutely fantastic 2-decade research on families and how they use the landscape. And so
that was outside of Chicago, right?
Yes, yeah, just amazing data. But it does demonstrate that coyotes are very territorial in the sense that they really do respect the neighboring coyotes, whether they're related or not, in some coyote families. And you can, look up, Dr. Gert's recent presentation that he did in Ottawa, and they will often give up sections of their territory to their offspring. And so you've got related family members sharing a particular landscape. But the transient coyotes that are working around those areas, they really don't have a home range, and so they're utilizing those fringe territories and keeping out of the way of that home range pair. And so, most folks see one coyote, but that doesn't mean there's not a family there, and sometimes they might see more, especially come early fall. They're going to see those sub-adults, those juveniles that are, their growth spurt in the last few months. They're going to look in similar size, but still quite, small compared to their adult parents. And so, we look at them as family, the same way that, wolves have their families.
And on that note, we had a great one. It's a twofer. How to tell coyotes, wolves apart, and how do coyote tracks differ from dogs and wolves, which are two kind of separate ones. And I think we've got a real opportunity to talk about the Algonquin wolf here too.
Yes. So, oftentimes you have to look at more than just the track. And, we often are doing consultation on tracks and, they don't realize what they need to do while in the field to really have a valuable sample set. You've got to have, get at least 3 to 6 or 8 tracks that you can see. There is opportunity to look at one track, and you can see with the coyotes, their 2 nails at their front paws, the nails come a little bit together, and they don't spread very far apart because they are very light. But it's the pattern in which they move. So you're looking at the track placement and their direct, when you look at wildlife, they really do use the land in a linear fashion because they're conserving energy. Domestic dogs are full of vim and vigor, and they're running all over the place. They're not conserving energy, and so oftentimes it's looking at how they're leaving their trail. That's a good indication. But in the landscape where you would have Algonquin wolves and eastern coyotes, you have to be careful because a small wolf is going to have a track similar to the coyote. So I think you have to look at the samples provide.
Well, also, we can say western coyotes are significantly smaller than an eastern wolf will be. Whereas in the east, the distinction between wolves and coyotes gets harder and harder, particularly with the genetically unique Algonquin wolf.
Absolutely. And I mean, visually, when you look at an eastern coyote, especially if there's, that back crossing between Algonquin wolf and eastern coyote families, which isn't really happening much anymore. The eastern coyote populations are very stable. The Algonquin wolf, they are under threat, and so they are staying within their own genetic pool, so to speak. But there are areas up north of Algonquin where you have the Algonquin wolf as a conduit for genetics between the gray wolf and the eastern coyote. And so a lot of times, without actually doing the DNA sampling, and that could be hair or scat, it's pretty difficult. If you look at a gray wolf and you look at an Algonquin wolf, you absolutely can see that there is quite a difference. But if you're looking at a young Algonquin wolf and an eastern coyote, it can be pretty tough. You can't tell the difference without genetic testing.
And that leads into the entire conversation about the protection of the Algonquin wolf in the sectors up there, which I don't know if you and I talked about that in an episode. I certainly talked with Hannah Barron from Earth Roots about the Algonquin wolf. I know that. So you can look in the back catalog for that interview to learn more about them.
And so Wolves Ontario and Earth Roots has done extensive work, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, just amazing research on the Algonquin wolf, the eastern coyote. And so all of that research and the studies that are currently underway are available. But, if you head over to that Wolves Ontario website, which is a sister of Earth Roots, there's great information there. And actually, Hannah Barron, who is also one of our scientific advisors, she's the wolf biologist that was doing the genetic, the sampling, the field sampling for the Ministry of Natural Resources, with the hopes that they could identify different territories for the Algonquin wolf.
And on that note, we had a question, and we'll try and keep this one somewhat tight in terms of the answer, because we've talked about this before, and we do have some content online for those who want to learn more, and I know you also have content about this. The question was, when a coyote mates with a gray wolf, do their pups become coy wolves? And this is I think we've probably spent an entire episode talking about coy wolves. So again, check out the back catalog. But let's give this one just a quick, what is a coy wolf, I guess maybe is the best way to start it.
So the coy wolf, the term, it's not used accurately. And when people are using the term coy wolf, they're thinking that an animal's half wolf, half coyote. Well, if we're going to go down that road, then all of our dogs, we'll call them wolf dogs, because they've got, if you go back far enough, they have ancient, wolf DNA in there somewhere. That's the origin of our domestic dogs, through that wolf lineage. But, eastern coyotes are not they're not actively mating with the gray wolf. The conduit for that genetic gene pool would be the Algonquin wolf, which has no problem doing that. But the genetics behind, looking at eastern coyotes actively mating with gray wolves is just, there's that whole genetic conversation is interesting, and it's worth looking into. But John Benson has done some great work with that. But I think people need to be really cognizant. We have eastern coyotes here, which some folks want to call them coy wolves. That's, I guess, fine, but they're not half wolf, they're not half coyote. And it's the western coyote and the Algonquin wolf that really is, the western coyote. And there's some, old dog DNA in there too, but, again, where and how that dog DNA was introduced is interesting. And I think when the science, if you look back 20 years ago, the science wasn't where it is today. And so we really didn't know that the eastern coyote was carrying this amazing genetic canid suit from the Algonquin wolf. And the Algonquin wolf used to be called the eastern wolf. And then that changed about 3 years ago.
Yep.
Ministry of Natural Resources went to the Algonquin wolf as the official name for this species.
Which caused controversy, it should be noted. It was, again, from my mild outsider perspective, the argument over what they should be called is it's both soap opera-ish on one hand and then scientifically really interesting on the other, because there are both those camps involved in naming a species. Moving forward, I'm trying to think of how to sort of put all of these together. I want to talk about farmers and agriculture. So this got asked a couple of different ways. One of them was someone saying, I've lived in the country on farms with livestock, dogs, etc. my whole life and never had an issue with coyotes. And I often saw them. Now I don't see them, but other people are constantly complaining. So sort of why do I not see them anymore, but other people are complaining, as well as the question of how can farmers and agriculture have a mutually beneficial relationship with coyotes, which I think is a great sort of spread across those two questions.
Well, that's probably a whole entire other show.
Which I think we've done, so look in the back catalog to learn more about that too.
Yeah, so when we contributed to wolf awareness, Sadie Parr, who is another wolf biologist who's done extensive work in BC, that Rancher's Tool Guide, in that document, it has just laid out wonderfully, and some of the information is based on other programs that have proved successful, that have incorporated some pretty amazing techniques to keep, livestock safe and also celebrate and live in harmony with the native carnivores. So with that, if you look at a particular farmscape, some of the things that were highlighted by the folks that we interviewed for our contribution for that Rancher's Toolkit, the Rancher's Guide, a couple of things that stood out. First of all, they said that they did not remove local food sources. So any of the smaller mammals, they were not actively killing those. They used multi-animal grazing together. They kept some natural areas. They also said, they liked having their local coyote family there, so they knew the family. They were not actively lethally removing them. And one of their number one things was the issue of domestic dogs, especially in rural locations, that they had a huge impact on, their livestock. And so I think there's so much information out there, and each situation is unique and different. Livestock guard dogs play an important role. Folks utilize donkeys, but the number one thing is that you're not encouraging, your dead stock to be left in the land. And so the farms and ranches that were successful and did not have issues with, coyotes in particular, they were not leaving dead stock. They didn't allow people to use their dead stock as bait piles to, shoot coyotes over. And so I think that's really telling, but there's so much information in those, generational family farms and ranches. And I think we really need to be willing to listen and engage and appreciate the hard work that they do and how they live truly in harmony with the land. And I mean, it's amazing. Some of their strategies are just wonderful. Whether it's outbuildings, some different farmers use each of their cattle has a number. They know exactly when, they'll be giving birth. They're put into the birthing stalls, and just a lot of really great strategies. The other side of that is that, of course, in Ontario, we do have the compensation program, but again, we don't have the time to get into that. But
yeah, that's an entire issue with a historic footnote to it as well.
Yeah. I mean, setting up trail cams in areas where there might be an elevation in predation or situations that, the farming family can't quite put their finger on, that can really disclose a lot of what might be happening in the landscape. And it's pretty telling and interesting when the trail cams go up. What you see is actually happening. It's not often what you think it is.
Yeah, and that's a quick anecdote. I got the opportunity to look at the footage from a trail cam up north, and looking at the visitors, it was just fun to look at. But one of the things, and Leslie and I were talking about this before this call, I saw raccoons, and I saw a fox, and I saw squirrels, but I also saw 4 different roaming dogs. One of them was JJ, to be fair, because we were there, but the other 3, I knew one of them is known to people in the area. The other 2, no one knew who those dogs were. They were just there. And this is not a region where, you've got a lot of people nearby. Those dogs had to come from somewhere. And there's a lot of reasons those dogs could be there. But again, I don't think, and I would personally absolutely love to see a study done with trail cams on agricultural property, comparing the number of dogs to the number of other wild canids that come through. But that's another conversation. I think this leads into one of the last 2 or 3 questions I have. And this is a great big one. This is my question because I always want to ask it, based on what you and I hear from people and what is often in the news. If getting rid of coyotes in one way or another, and everybody has their own version of what that means. Some it's relocate them all to Algonquin, some it's kill them, some it's, trap them and ask them not to. There's always different opinions on that. But if getting rid of or killing coyotes is the solution, why hasn't it worked? And I'm going to add a footnote to this question that the U.S. government has systematically been trying to get rid of coyotes in the West for about 200 years.
Yeah.
Like with biological warfare, they've been trying to get rid of coyotes in the West. Millions of dollars. And now we have arguably more coyotes.
Right. So I think probably describing population dynamics is a good place to start, because as soon as you remove the resident family, that land becomes vacant. Mm-hmm. And so, other coyotes will eventually find their way there. And so, we will often, have that discussion with property owners, especially in rural areas. Your canid family, work with what you have, make sure there's no attractants there, and if you do have livestock, keep in mind that any of those animals could become a food source, especially if you're looking at geese or hens, and could be food source for birds of prey, eagles, hawks, owls, and also mink and, fish, are depending on the location. But, I think we have to really look at it. It hasn't worked. Why would we repeat something that isn't working? And, you really don't know who's moving in. So you lethally remove the resident family, and you could have a coyote show up tomorrow, or it might not be for a year. Each location and landscape is so different, but especially around dispersal times, which isn't necessarily always in the fall. That used to be the old way of looking at the science, but we know now that some family members, the young ones, stay with mom and dad for a year or two, or they disperse late fall or early spring. It's not something that we can generalize anymore. And so, I think that killing, if there's people out there that just want to be killing something, then they're guaranteed to be able to keep up that kind of activity. If you're killing coyotes because you're trying to get rid of them, I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and that's certainly what we've seen. Again, I think ultimately, anytime I see this, my question is, how's that working out? Because I don't know of a single situation where people have effectively gotten rid of coyotes for the long term.
Well, no, and I mean, you will have the folks that think that every coyote should be killed. Yeah. And they're entitled to their opinion. It's not based on science or fact, but it's a feel-good solution. Or, there is that person out there that just wants to be able to kill coyotes. That's a completely different conversation. But, if you're looking at solving an issue, the first thing to do is get those trail cams up, or get folks to do that site visit, that investigation, to see what is actually going on. And, oftentimes, there's issues of people trespassing and shooting, and, livestock being shot at, and, coyotes are really a benefit for farming and ranching families.
Yep.
If they're doing all the great strategies and, practicing good husbandry, there's a pretty amazing relationship that can be forged between the wildlife there. And, oftentimes we've had folks say to us, yeah, they're keeping the groundhogs down, and, they're getting rid of those rodents. We've got, especially with vineyards, the rabbits will, chew on the bottom part of the vines. And if you've got, natural predators in the landscape, it's really helpful for those individuals that are doing that as a business.
Yeah, and I think something, a fun anecdote to include in this, when you're talking about the investigations, the importance of going and looking with a bit of a trained eye. So for the audience who may not know, Leslie and I met originally when I was a journalist in the suburbs, and I went with her on a little investigation around where some conflict had been happening, which she likes to joke about because I was wearing dress shoes and a trench coat, but I did keep up.
You did.
I did keep up. And I think the other thing that was very revealing of that to me was we saw so much crap. It was remarkable. Blue bins that had just like, it's like a 3-year-old child touched everything, then touched the blue bin. That's what it looked like. It was sticky and it had bits of stuff. And that was every third house had one like that. There were houses that had built gates into their backyard illegally, leading into a ravine to dump garbage. Like, pretty much. And then we ended up finding out someone in the area was actually directly feeding the coyote too later. But like, when you start asking those questions and stop thinking, well, my neighbors wouldn't do this or I couldn't do that, and go just look, sometimes it's surprising what you see and recognize as problems that you just simply wouldn't have thought were possible. Like the area we were in were $500,000 homes.
Absolutely. And I think, the the number one thrust for an investigation is to gather the evidence and facts. And so you don't go in there with a preconceived idea about what you're going to see or find or not find. You're basing it on evidence and fact. And some folks don't necessarily want that because maybe it's going to reveal things that have been going on in a particular location that has encouraged coyotes to hang around. And so, for a residential area that has maybe an increase or a trend of increase in sightings of a coyote coming to a backyard, it's really helpful for those residents to understand, wait a second here, I had no idea. People love the bird feeder, and we don't get into that. In bear country, your bird feeder better come down because bears have come out of the, hibernation, and it's just common sense to remove those attractants. There's plenty of natural foods around, but the bird feeder becomes the magnet because everything falls to the ground. And some folks have 6, 8, 10 bird feeders, and that is really a buffet for every animal species. And when we go into urban locations, it's pretty telling because the wildlife indicates where things are happening, where the hot spots are. Because you'll see those hawks sitting on the weather vanes. Some of them actually put nests near bird feeder locations, so it's easy pickings for the smaller birds. And so if we can empower residents to understand how they can change the dynamics between themselves and the wildlife, it's really worked very well. And there's so many communities that are doing great initiatives, with their community members and the wildlife, in particular coyotes.
Well, and again, I can say we deal with a lot of bears in British Columbia as an organization. It is a topic that comes back year after year after year for us. And feeding directly and indirectly is the vast majority of the time the problem. And the same has been true with my experience with coyotes. When we talk about beaver conflict, it's still resources, right? You make beaver habitat, beavers are going to show up. In an urban center, you talk about why are there so many seagulls? Because you keep leaving food in shopping malls. It's that simple. But that leads into the final two I want to go on. One, this came from my very good friend Eli, and he asked 3 great questions in succession, and I want to ask all of them because I think they're great.
Okay. I'll see what I can do.
I need exact answers.
Okay.
You will be checked after. So first, do they have a home base once pups are up and about? So talking about the den location. Do they all stay together in one spot? Do they start to disperse? How does that work?
So are we talking, during the summer months or fall or what
I think
time of year? Generally,
once the pups are, pups of the year, right? So they're up, they're moving around, they're starting to play and hunt. You're going to see those yearlings out with the alpha pair or the mated pair. Do they stick to a home base or do they start living in multiple den sites?
No. Once they're weaned and they're moved by the mom and dad. Sometimes those moves, by the way, are premature. So certain scenarios, if a den is disturbed or there's construction that starts or maybe somebody has their lawn cut, a lot of times homeowners won't even realize that there's a den at the way at the back of their property. So if mom and dad feel the pups are in danger, they will move them. And oftentimes it ends up being a location that's not optimal. It could be a culvert. It could be in a window well. Folks that aren't home, they have a place in Florida, especially during COVID. There's a real interesting trend that we're seeing in terms of den selection that had never been used before or chosen before. So once they've been weaned and they're at that rendezvous site or that safe zone, they start following mom and dad around after. That again, it's a really tight developmental stage for young coyote pups. And so once they're not going back into the den. First of all, they're too big. They might go back to that location as a security, which we have observed in different family locations, but they're not going to be using that den. Maybe next spring, perhaps, as long as infrastructure and isn't occurring there. But so they're going to stay in their home range, which is defined. And other coyotes, that's why mom and dad are constantly vocalizing, and the pups learn how to vocalize. They're defending and sending out that amazing vocal warning that this land is taken, and so they stay within that. But once they are dispersing, then they have to navigate through a completely different world. And that dispersal, as I mentioned earlier on in our discussion, every family is different. Some of the family members might stay together. And we don't know enough about their behavior, and it's so difficult because, again, it's resource-based, it's, infrastructure, human activity. All of those things are going to impact how a family utilizes their home range and who in that family is going to remain with mom and dad, or maybe they're going to be given a section of the old territory, which they can now call their own. And again, I just urge listeners to go to Dr. Stan Gert's research, because it is just a work of art when you look at the patterns, the land use, and everything is color-coded, and you see how respectful the different coyote families are of their neighboring territories.
Yeah, he used a radio collar telemetry for that, I think, didn't he? Or was he GPS? Okay. And there's a bunch more questions. We got so many questions, and I am so thankful for everyone, because it was wonderful to see.
Thank you too, because we had so many amazing questions on Coyote Watch Canada. And some folks DM them, some of them put I thought, and anytime we can get our supporters and animal advocates to express a concern or a question or a curiosity, I think it's just amazing. And there's so many engaged, compassionate folks out there. And I know from fur bearers into our organization, we just have an amazing circle of people that are doing great work, from scientists to artists to teachers to just incredibly exciting individuals that contribute to bringing coexistence to the forefront.
Yeah, and it's actually I've met some great artists through Coyote Watch Canada events, like Jaswinder Singh down in Niagara, who does some wonderful stuff and always does great coyote paintings that are quite enjoyable. So if people want to look them up online, you'll see some fun stuff. And the final question we're going to get to, because I think we can have a bit of poetry with this as well as fact. What do all coyote sounds mean? What are they saying? And I love looking at conversations about this and all of the different interpretations of what those songs mean. So what, in general, what are coyotes saying when they're singing?
Well, I mean, if we go just to kind of the Cole's Notes approach to it, unless you're actually familiar with and engaging, observing, or researching a particular family, the tone and the style in which they're vocalizing can tell a lot. The barking is a warning, a distress, long howling. We have documentation of, a coyote that is in a trap, that is calling for the mate, or a mate calling for their mate that is in rehabilitation, having surgery because of a snare around his neck. And the family calls and calls on a nightly basis, hoping that that partner will answer back. And so, but, any time that coyotes are vocalizing, not only is that a bonding opportunity between family members, it's also helping those transient coyotes to understand that, yes, this is this is not vacant land, it's taken, but also it's for location, identifying where a family member is, and also, celebration. Oftentimes, especially during the mating season, their vocalizations, some families are very vocal, and other times
I
they're
think
not.
I have those ones living next door to me, but they're not coyotes.
Yeah. But, and in the beginning of the work, I used to be, oh my gosh, something's happened. I haven't heard them vocalize, and you get concerned and think, holy Hannah, have they moved on, or were they hit by a car? Were they killed? And then all of a sudden, the cacophony starts. And I think what folks need to understand, and some great research has been done in terms of actually concluding how many are vocalizing. And so it was 2 out of 3 times that, they misunderstood, and they elevated the number of actual coyotes vocalizing, and we use that as part of our public presentations. But so discerning for folks when they're hearing that in the middle of the night, and it sounds like it's really close, and I mean that vocalization can travel over a mile, especially in good weather. And so also, the myth that surrounds that too, that they're vocalizing when they've killed something. It's such a, when you really look at it, it's a silly myth, but it is a myth that has been ingrained in our generation, and it's shared, it's repeated over and over again as fact. I mean, it'd be like us singing opera, right? It's just ridiculous. They're not going to advertise it, that they're killing something. They're busy doing their work, and I think, for folks, though, that don't understand that vocalization, they don't have cell phones. That's their GPS. Mm-hmm. Canid vocalization is an area, and I mean, the nuances and the subtleties and the tones. I mean, different families have slightly different tones, and I mean, it's pretty incredible. In the beginning, the early stages when we were doing the field work, doing the calls and vocalizing to see if they would respond back, we stopped doing that so long ago because it's just for ethical reasons, right? We weren't, looking to change their behavior. And if a coyote family's way over, 2 kilometers away, and they're hearing something and they got to use that energy to come back and see what the heck it is, it's not really ethical. But, and we can sound very much like another predator. So, that's one of the things you learn. We change how we do the field work and research.
To get in touch with Coyote Watch Canada or learn more about them, visit their website at coyotewatchcanada.com or visit them on social media. I want to thank Leslie for spending so much time on this interview with me, and for just right now finding out she's going to help me write a few articles to answer more of your questions next week. We both want to thank all of you for your great questions, as well for tuning in and listening to this episode. Please do share it with friends and family. The more people know about coyotes, the less they fear them, and the more we can really coexist and flourish. Remember to follow me on social media for updates on episodes, interviews, adorable photos of JJ the Hamilton Hound, and more. I'm at Defender Radio on Twitter and Facebook, and at Howie Michael on Instagram. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to be kind and to stay informed and stay strong.